Well, good morning, everyone, and good morning, first of all, to all those people gathered here in the Church of Christ the Eternal High Priest in Gidea Park for the in-person presentation. And I know there's a lot of people out there also watching online, or people who will be watching online in the next days, weeks, and months. Who knows? Today, our topic is serving Christ in a hostile environment. And that's obviously attracted you. You thought, well, that sounds very interesting. I'm interested in serving Christ, but maybe a hostile environment? Am I up to that? How do I do that? So how do we, particularly say in Britain in these days, how do we preach the gospel? How do we live the gospel? What's the way forward for us in a time where, quite frankly, people are lost on so many fronts? And we have this morning, or whenever you're watching, we have an expert speaker on all these things, Father Damian Howard, who is the provincial of the Jesuits in Britain. So we've really got a speaker who can address those issues, and I'm sure you'll be very intrigued to hear what Father Damian's going to say. He lectured at Heathrow College, and I think since 2017 has been provincial of the Jesuits. So without further ado, would you please welcome Damian Howard. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Adrian, for that totally misleading introduction. Expert on all these things, I wish. I was having breakfast this morning with one of the Jesuits in my community and trying to make small talk as usual, and he said to me, "So Damian, what's the day got planned for you?" And I said, "Well, I'm off to give a talk in Gidea Park." And his eyes popped open and he said, "Oh, that's very impressive. It's a wonderful setup they've got there of great talks and fantastic speakers." And he then said, "Actually, I was a speaker there once." And that made me feel very, very grateful that I've been invited today. So thank you very much indeed, Father Adrian, and all of you for coming out on what's been looking like the best day of the year so far. His face then changed as he started to think, and he said, "And what are you going to talk about?" And I think what he meant was, what on earth are you going to talk about? Because Jesuits can be a little bit, I won't say cynical, but suspicious of each other sometimes. And he's absolutely right to have that question, what am I going to talk about? The one thing I'm probably qualified to say something about is Christian-Muslim relations, because that's what my doctorate was in, roughly, that kind of area. And that's what I used to teach in when I was a lecturer at Heathrow. But I was asked by Father Adrian to talk about whatever seemed important to me. It's really cruel to give someone a totally open invitation like that, because it really forces you to think, what is really important to me? And at the moment, I wouldn't put Christian-Muslim relations right at the top of the list. An important topic, believe me, but I wouldn't put it right up there as the most important thing. So the good news is this is what I think is really important. The bad news is I'm not an expert in any of the things I'm going to talk about at all. I'm going to talk about brain science, I'm going to talk about scripture, I'm going to talk about Pope Francis's teaching. And I am just not an expert in any of those things. I've got a clue about some of them, and you can try and guess which of them they are. But on the whole, what I'm just going to try and do is bring together some ideas in a vaguely suggestive way, which I hope will leave you with lots and lots of questions and lots of things to think about, rather than a sense that you very worthily sat through 2 hours of a world expert talking, leaving the footnotes out, but otherwise giving you sort of infallible wisdom and experience. I'm full of questions at this stage in my life and at this stage in our history, and I don't think that's a terribly bad place to be. So that's a little introduction into where I'm going. I've chosen a very odd title, deliberately to mislead you again, hopefully to get your curiosity. I guess there are two ways in which you might be taking this, largely depending on your current political affiliation. I don't want to get into politics for reasons that will become very clear shortly. But hostile environment, some of you will immediately have picked up the reference to Theresa May's famous policy a few years ago when she was Home Secretary to create a hostile environment for the people she would have called illegal immigrants. Do you remember the campaign of... Yeah, okay, so you've got that. So am I going to do a sort of presentation of the Jesuit refugee service and a sort of strong social justice talk all about that sort of thing? No. So if you came for that, there you are. I've led you into a trap. Apologies for that. There's another version around today as well, which talks about a hostile environment to faith. And you hear about people worried about free speech. You hear about cancel culture, the dangers of woke, whatever that is. That creates a hostile environment for faith. Apparently, I'm not going to talk about that either. So anybody, you're free to go offline now. If that's what you were hoping for, you're free to leave the church if you were hoping for either of those. Why am I avoiding those like the plague? Because I think they are a massive distraction from what the real questions are about what I would call a hostile environment for faith in a country like Britain in the 21st century. We human beings are very, very good at getting distracted by false issues. I say false issues. Actually, refugees and asylum seekers and immigration is really important. Actually, freedom of speech and freedom of religion, that's really important too. And I'm a strong advocate of both of those causes. But at the moment we get into, as you will probably have noticed, you may have even found yourself drawn into the whirlpool of this yourself, we get into this horrible, polarized, polemical opposition in which we constantly denounce people on the other side, a kind of horrible tribalism that is both divisive, which isn't good, but more importantly, I think it's a massive distraction. It keeps everybody busy and worried and emotionally engaged while actually ignoring some of the really deep causes of the malaise that our world is currently in. So there you are. As I say, freedom to walk out now. Nobody's gone. That's really kind of you. I'm going to start with a bit of a biblical meditation. The first half of the presentation will be a long, I hope, inviting and imagination-provoking account of a beautiful passage from the Gospel of Luke. Any of you who know anything about Ignatian spirituality, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, the founding spirituality of us Jesuits, will know that one of the most transformative exercises for him was to imagine yourself into a biblical scene. He would take an hour and carefully, slowly create the scene in his own mind and let it play out, as if to tell himself that the incarnation, the imaginative world of Jesus itself was a pedagogy, a way into the mind of God, and that by gazing on that and contemplating it, we too would somehow take on something of God's own way of seeing the world. So, without putting you all into a trance state and hypnotizing, it's not like that, I will be taking you through a passage from St. Luke's Gospel, which I think is the paradigm case for us of Christ in a hostile environment. And I'll leave you maybe with a few questions to chew over with your sandwiches while we have a half-hour break, and then I will come back with some of the ideas that Pope Francis has been putting to us over the last 10 plus years, and trying to link them to what I talked about in the first half. Up to you to see if you can make the links. I'm not going to labour those. But I like to think that it all creates one great coherent whole, but that you're going to have to work a little bit to make some of those connections. And the connections that you make will probably be more important than anything I would make. So that's where we're going. Is that okay? Fantastic. Let me start then, just before we get into Luke's Gospel, with three little vignettes about what I'm calling a hostile environment, because having evoked that, I think I owe you a little bit of an explanation of why I think Europe in 2021 is something of a hostile environment to Jesus Christ and his message. Three vignettes, three cameo scenes from the confessional. The first one is the straightforward one, the beautiful one. Anybody who's ever read anything about Pope Francis and his journey of discipleship, his journey into the faith, might remember that scene that he's often talked about, a very, very simple scene, about being a young man towards the end of adolescence, wondering about getting married. And then one evening he just finds himself drawn into the Catholic Church in his town, and there's a priest who almost, he senses, is waiting to listen to him and to hear and receive his confession. It's the simplest of scenes, isn't it? But one that I think makes an awful lot of sense to us Catholics. The sight of the confessional, the sacrament of reconciliation is one we can be scared of, but it's scary because it's really important. And Francis found himself, the young Bergoglio, found himself changed and inspired by the experience of a priest waiting to receive his confession and to extend to him the experience of God's loving mercy. And he talks about that. It's the simplest story. I think it's very moving and very beautiful. I've got my own little story about confession from my ministry as a priest. A few years ago, I was the chaplain in the health faculty of a university in the West Midlands. I am, you may already have realised, quite a shy and introverted person, and this was an extremely secular environment, which I remember having to stride down long corridors of steel and glass, trying to project a sort of welcoming personality, which I find very difficult indeed, to all these trainee nurses, and massively failing. It was a constant experience of feeling vulnerable and useless, and some of you are nodding as though you know what that might feel like. The low point. I'm sitting in a canteen, in my collar being visible and available, probably looking as though I really wanted to get out of there, having a cup of coffee, when a young woman came over from the table of students over there and said, "Father, it's so nice to see you there. Can I talk to you later this afternoon? I need you to hear my confession." Tremendous sense of meaning and purpose and relief. At last, my being here is worth it. So I immediately, probably looking a bit needy and desperate, made an appointment with her, invited her up to the little room which was given to me to have these rare pastoral encounters. And I gave her my mobile phone number so that if she got lost or didn't know where to come, she could make contact with me. So off I go when the time comes, and I'm sitting in the room waiting and beginning to notice that it's a bit late, and then the phone call comes. And I say, "Hello?" And a whole table full of students just laugh down the phone. It was a really horrible experience. I don't know what you were expecting there. This is not a feel-good story, and it still doesn't make me feel good today. I've obviously forgiven and moved on, but it's really brought home to me something of the exposure, that sense of being exposed in ministry in a totally secular environment, where you don't even represent something bad, you're just something funny. You're something not to be taken seriously, and you're something to be ridiculed and mocked. Now, I'm not saying I've had that experience terribly often, but it's there, and it certainly gave me a sense that actually going into that place day after day was really challenging. I was in quite a hostile environment. Okay, no big deal, but it's part of the reality. I think it's a good check for us, just to remember that those of us who aren't necessarily exposed as people of faith to a secular society, just to remember what that means. Third cameo is from a different cleric, a prelate of the 20th century, story told by Jean-Marie Lustiger, who used to be Archbishop of Paris. He told the story of a group of lads, young men in a village, again deciding to play a prank on a parish priest who's hearing confessions in the little village church. And they decide that they're each going to go in and say absolutely appalling things that they've done. Again, sending up the sacrament of reconciliation, making it a place of ridicule and fun. So they go in, they're playing a game. Okay, they're young. At the end, there's a little Jewish kid in the group who goes in, take part in the fun, and at the end, the parish priest says, "Okay, thank you for your confession. For your penance, I want you to go to the front of the church and to stand in front of the crucifix. And I want you to say 3 times, Lord Jesus, I know you died for my sins, and I couldn't give a damn. And the boy went up, and he said it once, and he said it a second time, and he couldn't say it a third time, because something had already started to move inside him. A boy of Jewish faith and origins, not a Catholic or a Christian at all, but he started to twig that something was going on here. Well, the boy was Jean-Marie Lustiger. He went on to become a priest and Archbishop of Paris. But what a brilliant bit of pastoral ministry from that parish priest. Extraordinary. Bold, clear, and extremely fruitful. Makes me feel even worse about my little escapade in the university in Birmingham, where I was just at a loss to know what to do. That priest knows how to function in a hostile environment. And it seems to me that's something we could really learn from. That's the kind of hostility that I'm talking about. It's not really political. Something of culture in it. Obviously a lot of it's to do with the human heart and a kind of resistance to God. And I don't know where you would locate that in your own life, because we all resist God in that way. We all resist grace in some way. But I've got a feeling that in every generation, in every age, that kind of resistance migrates, it moves, it takes on a new expression. And what I want to do today is really go deep into that in our own experience through the biblical story that I'm going to come to now, but then also listen to Pope Francis and his own sense of where that comes from and what it means, and therefore how we might deal with it effectively, maybe even as effectively as that French parish priest that day. So let's get into Luke. And I told you I'm not an expert on any of the things I'm going to talk about, so I'm going to tell you where I get my material from. I think that's only honest. Really interesting book by Kenneth Bailey, came out quite a long time ago now, called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. He opened my eyes to the way in which actually having a little bit of an understanding of the culture of the Middle East at the time of Jesus makes an enormous difference to the way that we read the Gospels. So do feel free to order that online if you would like. But that's where I'm getting most of the thoughts for the first part of this. He's really, for me, unpacked a gospel passage that I got very stuck in for a long time, and I think now makes a lot more sense to me. Shall we go into that? Are you ready for a little bit of scripture study? Luke 7. The woman who was a sinner. What a great title. I think that's the one in many of the Bibles that we use. The woman who welcomed Jesus might be a slightly better entree into the world of this. I'm probably going to keep calling it a parable, because in a way that's what it is, but it's actually presented as a historical event in the life of Jesus. But it has certain qualities of the parable about it which I think are really, really interesting. I'm just going to take us through first of all, and then we'll come back and we'll start exploring some of quite complicated dynamics going on in there. But I know it's very familiar to you. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And a woman in the city who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment. She stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and to dry them with her hair. Then she continued kissing his feet and anointing them with the ointment. Now, when the Pharisee, who had invited him, saw it, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is who is touching him, that she is a sinner." Jesus spoke up and said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." "Teacher," he replied, "speak." A certain creditor had 2 debtors. Hey, a real parable. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they couldn't pay, he cancelled the debts for both of them. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon answered, I suppose the one for whom he cancelled the greater debt. And Jesus said to him, You have judged rightly. Then turning towards the woman, he said to Simon, Do you see this woman? I entered your house, you gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You didn't anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. Hence she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. Then he said to her, Your sins are forgiven. But those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, Who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Quite a lot going on there. I don't know what your mind immediately gets into as though, what's the essence of this story all about? In the past, I've tended to fix on the question of love and forgiveness as though Jesus is teaching us something very important about if you love, then you get forgiven, or is it that if you get forgiven, then you love? There's something going on there that's very important. But I've missed something, and I think that's what's really interesting. So let me start to unfold some of the subtly present issues that I think give you a very different picture of what's going on here. First thing we find is the story is not told chronologically. You think it is, but it's actually not. We find out something about what happened early on in this scene only when we're already halfway through, in fact, quite towards the end. We find out about how Jesus was welcomed into the house of the Pharisee. We ought to know that before, wouldn't we, really? What was important about the welcome? This is where, being North Londoners, you're in Essex here, aren't we? Apologies for that. Oh my gosh. This is where being 21st century people in this part of the world doesn't help, because I'm guessing that if you were very kindly to welcome me into your house, you wouldn't wash my feet and you wouldn't anoint me with oil and you probably wouldn't give me a big hug. There'd be quite a discreet English type greeting, rather minimalist certainly by Middle Eastern standards, and that would be perfectly normal. What's going on here is that Jesus has been invited to a house where he has then not received any formal welcome. I suppose it would be, if you want to update it, it would be like being invited to somebody's house and instead of coming to the door they sort of shout from the shower, oh, let yourself in and make yourself a cup of tea or something like that. I remember when I was a very young curate once going to visit a family during the day, and they just sat there watching the television the whole time. They didn't even talk to me. Again, it was a one-off, but you remember these things. That's what's going on here, right? We don't get that unless we've got the Middle Eastern expectation in our minds. Jesus is being snubbed in the most blunt and humiliating way. Why would that be the case? Why would a Pharisee invite Jesus to his house and then treat him like dirt? Is it because he's being welcomed into a lovely meal? No, I think it's so that he can be put in his place. This young upstart rabbi who thinks he knows it all, getting a bit above himself, well, he can come to my house and he can see just how low he is in the pecking order. Jesus has been invited here not to have a lovely meal, certainly not to have a wonderful debate about theology, about the Torah. He's being humiliated. It takes us back to the hostile environment, right? He's been here, invited here to be mocked and ridiculed. It's a very painful situation, and I think we need to have that foundation in our minds if we're going to understand the rest of the story. He's being invited to be put in his place. That means the atmosphere is electric with tension. If you ever see some of the beautiful images that artists in the Western tradition have created to give of this picture, they've all missed this point too. There's a beautiful banquet going on and Jesus is sitting there being listened to. No, that's not what's going on here. This is a scene of humiliation. The atmosphere is very, very tense indeed. What's Jesus' response to that? Well, what would your response be to that? I tell you what mine would be. I would get out of there straight away as quickly as I could, because I don't like conflict. I certainly don't like being humiliated. And so I'd be out of there. What does it say? Jesus went in and took his place at the table. So he hasn't been welcomed, but he goes straight in to the table and reclines, because of course in those days you didn't sit at a table, you reclined next to the banquet. What astonishing boldness and confidence. Not put off at all. I mean, I don't know what he's feeling, but he just goes in straight and is not deterred from what he's going to do. I don't suppose he's got a great strategy, but he's certainly got conviction and courage. Maybe that's the first lesson for us about working in a hostile environment. And that's the lesson of that priest, wasn't it, in the little French church? Don't be put off. Don't sort of phone the helpline and say, I'm feeling upset. No, you go in. You go in. Bold, confident. I find that very challenging because I don't feel like that most of the time myself. So what then happens? Jesus is sitting at the table and suddenly we find the woman who was a sinner. Now, Scripture doesn't tell us at all what she is doing there. No idea. We can maybe speculate and put a few thoughts together, but I mean, there's no explanation of why she is in this Pharisee's house. I think we can assume she knows who Jesus is, because she's brought an alabaster jar with her, which will have cost a lot of money, and presumably rather heavy to carry around. So there's a real sense of purpose here. She's brought out with her, don't know why. And presumably if she's heard him, heard his message, maybe he's heard the message of love and compassion, that even the prostitutes and the tax collectors are making their way into the kingdom of heaven before the Pharisees. Maybe she's heard that, has been really encouraged by that, healed, sensing that she's being invited into something where before she's only known exclusion and pain. I don't know. These are speculations, but I've got a feeling it must be that kind of thing. Maybe she's even heard about what Simon and his chums are planning. Yeah? Maybe she's in on the secret. Maybe it's not a secret, I don't know. That this is going to be a showdown. Jesus is going to be humiliated. And she wants to be there. I don't know, but this is where our imaginations, I think, have to come into play. So, what does she do? She stood behind him at his feet weeping. Why would she be weeping? Well, I mean, this story makes me weep, to be honest. You can probably hear it a little bit in my voice, and it's not feigned. I can't do that. I mean, I just find this is a very visceral story. And I would have thought to watch somebody she loves and who's helped her and offered her healing and inclusion, to see him being humiliated would touch her. Maybe she's weeping for that sort of reason. And she began to bathe his feet with her tears and to dry them with her hair. That is very odd behaviour. Very odd behaviour indeed. What's going on there? Well, she's offering the welcome that Jesus was denied by Simon and his household. She's going to wash his feet. Is she going to go to the tap and ask somebody for a bucket? Well, of course not, because she's the object of hostility herself, just like Jesus is. Nobody's going to cooperate with her. The servants aren't going to say, oh yes, let me rush off and get you a towel so that you can do what we have deliberately denied Jesus. So she washes his feet with the only water available to her, her own tears. I mean, it's as simple as that. And then she dries them with the only towel that she has available to her own hair. I think it's as simple as that. She's doing what she can to remedy this painful situation with the only resources that she has available. Notice in so doing, she lets down her hair, which, again, we're back in Middle Eastern culture. I mean, this would be odd in our culture, right, to dry somebody's feet with your hair. I wouldn't be able to do it myself, sadly. But in those days, a woman would only show her hair to her husband, right? So what she's doing here is not just practically odd, which is what we would pick up, but it's also a little bit scandalous, more than a little bit scandalous. And already we're in that territory of sexual impropriety. What kind of woman is this? Exactly what is Jesus getting involved with here? Because this is putting him in an extremely delicate situation. I hope you picked that up. It's not just that dear old Jesus is being tended to and supported by this woman, but he's now also being forced, as it were, to collude with her ambiguous behaviour. That's what's going on when Simon starts thinking, does this guy know what's going on? I mean, what sort of a man is this? And that whole theme of scandal, sexual ambiguity, it's there, and it's scary. In this culture, this is really scary stuff. So the tension has been ratcheted up quite a lot in a few short minutes. This is a really, really difficult scene to be present to. So Jesus says, he gives him the story. I'm not going to dwell on the parable, because in a funny way, I don't think it is the most important thing. And I'll leave you to think about that. The debtor, the one who's forgiven more because he's been, the one who loves more because he's been forgiven more. Fine, that's an easy theme to understand, and you can see what Jesus is getting at as he talks to Simon. He's re-describing the scene, disengaging from the question of hostility and humiliation, certainly disengaging from the question of scandal and sexual impropriety here. He's not looking at those things at all. He's looking at love and forgiveness. That's how he's describing this scene. That's a really radical and important thing to do. But then Jesus does something absolutely shocking. And I think even in our barbaric, modern Western culture, we would never do this. Has anybody ever complained to their host about the hospitality they have received? Hands up, and you at home as well. No hands are going up. What do we do when we're not impressed with the quality of the soup? This is delicious. How did you... Of course. When you receive hospitality that you think falls short, the last thing you would ever do is to say, well, I think you could have been a bit better dressed, to be honest. The conversation was terribly tedious. Your anecdotes are awfully repetitive. Do you think you could work on those? No, you don't. Well, of course. And that's not just a British thing, right? Although we probably make that into a bit of an art form. This is the international expectation about hospitality, folks. You always praise your host, you always thank them, even if secretly you think it could have been a little bit up a notch or two. Well, Jesus goes in for the jugular here. And this is really interesting too. Do you see this woman? I entered your house, you gave me no water for my feet, but she's bathed my feet with her tears, dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she's not stopped kissing my feet. You didn't anoint my head with oil, but she's anointed my feet with ointment. Well, two things there. One is, he has named what's been unspoken up to now. Because, of course, the reason that the humiliation has power is because no one dare name it. That's true, isn't it? We must never speak about what's going on here because it's against all the taboo. You don't criticize bad hospitality. Therefore, a host who deliberately, shamelessly humiliates you puts you in a position of a kind of double victimhood because you can't complain about it. Well, Jesus names it. he puts it on the table. And in that way, of course, he takes out all its power, because we can now talk about it. I mean, whether we do or not depends a little bit on Simon and his response. Is he suddenly going to break out in a fit of repentance and say, "You're absolutely right, Rabbi. I've treated you appallingly. I do apologize. This should never happen"? Well, the answer is no. Because the second point is that this unforgivable breach of etiquette, criticizing your host's hospitality, can only result in violence. Jesus has in effect just signed his own death warrant. He spent all his capital, if he had any, and is now in the presence of a bitter, implacable enemy who will surely want to force home the humiliation that he was planning all along. And I think we see the path to the cross, not starting here because it started some time ago, but certainly another milestone on that journey. Jesus creating implacable foes and in the process lining himself up for that culminating act of violence on Calvary. I think these insights help give a picture of the tension in this story, and they really are astonishing when you start to enter into them. The little parable, for all that it's true and important, somehow takes second place, I think, to the human drama that's going on here. But there's one question left hanging at this stage in the story. The woman and Jesus. He is humiliated, he's burnt all his bridges, he's got no social capital left in this scenario. She has taken a huge risk by expressing this futile gesture of solidarity, which nobody is very impressed with. But in the process has made Jesus also even more ridiculous, even more subject to suspicion than he was in the first place. Because now there's a whiff of scandal hanging over him, as though, he doesn't know that this woman is a prostitute, a woman of poor morals, or if he does, then gosh, that's even worse. What's going on here? The one thing that Jesus could do to salvage the situation, what is it at this stage? He could disown her. I have to say, that's probably what I would do, at this stage. Your heart's beating inside you, you're hot, you're surrounded by people who hate you and are judging you, and you're thinking, how on earth do I get out of this incredibly painful situation? Well, the last thing I'm going to worry about is this woman who I don't know, means nothing to me at all. She's done something very stupid. Just brush her aside like another piece of human detritus. Must have been a strong temptation. It's what most people, I suspect, would have done. And that's, once you realize that's the logical way to move, then Jesus' response is even more astonishing. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven, because she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. And then he talks to her for the first time in the whole story. Up till now, he's just talked about this woman. And of course, again, Middle Eastern culture, a rabbi, a respectable man, doesn't talk to a strange woman in a public place because of the tight rules surrounding who you communicate with. Certainly not somebody who's a public sinner. He turned to her and said, "Your sins are forgiven." It's an astonishingly bold thing to do. Astonishing. This tense moment when so much is at stake for him. He turns to her, speaks to her, again against all the taboos, and says basically, what you have done is good and right and beautiful. I love this picture of two people who've taken a chance on each other. Yeah, she's taken a huge risk to expose herself in the way that she has. Now he meets that. He meets that by reaching out to her, recognizing her dignity, and confirming, I suspect, the message that she had heard in the first place. A message of forgiveness and reconciliation and mercy, a welcome back into the people of God from which prostitutes and tax collectors are usually totally cast out. Gosh. Did this passage mean all that to you before? When this passage was opened up for me, I suddenly realized this is really, really powerful. This is a wonderful parable of what it means to follow Jesus, to serve Christ in a hostile environment. And there's an awful lot in there for us to unpack and to reflect on. Do you want just to spend a minute or two in silence, both if you're at home and in the church, just for a moment, just noticing whatever it is that's captured your imagination, that's touched you in all of that? Just give you a minute to your thoughts. Ideally, we'd take a bit of time to chat to each other and buzz and small group work and all of that stuff. Those of you who don't like that will be relieved that we can't do it very easily today because of the technological side of things. But you might like to make a note about what's helped and touched you in that, because I've got a feeling that there are going to be a few little pointers for each of us in terms of how we witness to Christ in a hostile environment. I'm going to leave that there for the moment and just want to look at this painting which I've just put up. Rubens, one of my favourite painters, not least because he did a wonderful image of St. Ignatius, which made him look fabulous in a chasuble. But this is a slightly different picture, well, a very different picture indeed. It's his imagining of that scene in Simon the Pharisee's house. Sorry, it's not super clear on a really sunny day, but you can always look it up on the internet. It is a sumptuous image, and we'll come back to it in the second half because I'm just going to try and unpack some of the things that Rubens might be telling us about this great scene. But just let your eyes linger on it for a minute. If anybody wants to come a little bit closer, that's absolutely fine. Do feel free to do that. If you want to download it on your mobile phone, by all means feel free to do that too. What you see in the far right corner is the Lord himself, sitting at a table, not reclining. Okay, so this isn't maybe historically accurate to the cultural expectations of the early Middle East, but it's certainly the kind of table that Rubens would have known. And there he is, talking to probably Simon. We imagine that this is part of that rather challenging dialogue that he's having with his host. Meanwhile, at the bottom is the woman. It's an extraordinary posture that she's caught in. I don't know if you can see, she's, as it were, surrounding Jesus' foot. Beautiful image of love and devotion. I'm not sure if you can see her tears. I'll have to get a bit closer than I can to know exactly what she's doing. Or maybe she's drying his feet with her hair. It's an absolutely beautiful image of her focus on him and of her solidarity with him. Next to Jesus, you can just see the faces of 3 of his disciples. And again, look at the postures of them. One of them is holding a handkerchief. Perhaps he's caught up in the emotion of the moment. Another is looking at his neighbour, and another is looking off into the middle distance as though caught up in contemplation, wondering what all this means. So you've got all the postures of the church, if you like, of the believing community. Solidarity, community, contemplation. Beautiful little image of the church, of God's people gathered next to Jesus. So that's the sort of this third of the image. And then the other 2/3 with the background of the sky, beautiful Rubens sky there. Well, my goodness, there's an awful lot going on. Lots of activity. People carrying food on their heads. This is going to be a real banquet, folks. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it was like. I don't know. But Rubens is certainly very keen to tell us something about that group of people, the people who are part of Simon's community, part of Simon's way of seeing things. And there's immense movement and bustle. Somebody's got a peacock, a dead peacock on a tray. We'll try and remember to come back to what that might mean in the second half, but I think it's quite important. And in the middle, the table that makes us think of the Eucharist, perhaps, that makes us think of communion, the fact that there was a betrayer, a traitor at the table of the Eucharist with Jesus, so this is not a safe place. It's a place where Jesus offers himself. A lot going on there. Again, just have a look at it and get a sense of what the emotions are that this brings up in you. What's your response to this image? I don't really think Rubens has grasped all the points I've tried to put across. I suspect he's not an expert in Middle Eastern culture of the first century. That doesn't matter too much, though. He's grasped something really important about those who believe in Jesus and those who don't. And we'll shortly go off to have our half-hour break, just to get over this. And I want to leave you with a few questions to chew over. If you're right at the back of the church, you won't be able to read this very easily, but I'm going to read it out anyway. And you don't have to talk to people over the sandwiches about these things, but obviously if you will, I'm sure they'll be very hospitable to your desire to share. The first: how do I feel challenged in my Christian life by the story of Jesus at Simon's house? I've shared plenty of my own feelings about how I feel challenged. Conflict, aversion, social etiquette and taboos, which I rigorously adhere to. Desire for an easy life, not to get drawn into difficult human situations. Certainly, I don't want anybody thinking bad things about me. I don't want a bad reputation. And I really don't want to lose my social capital. Those are very natural things to want to avoid. So those might be some of the answers you have, but you'll have your own sense of that. Slightly moving into a more public sphere, where do I encounter hostility to the mission of Christ? Where do I encounter hostility to the mission of Christ? And how do I handle it? And your answer might be, well, I just don't. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But it might also be that you do feel a little bit constrained in certain situations not to enter into the great world of compassion, solidarity, mercy, love that are at the centre of Jesus' mission. Might be areas in which you really want to play it safe. I wonder what they're like. I wonder where they are. And then this is really getting a little bit more reflective. In a word, where do I locate the nub of the hostility? And obviously there you need a concrete example, I think, just to say, all right, I feel very much in my workplace, I feel judged as a Christian, I can't talk about it. Why is that? What's the heart of the resistance? Where is the hostility to that coming from? And it could be very good reasons. It could be that God botherers and religious fanatics and fundamentalists have driven people so up the wall that they just can't contemplate being nice and open to religious people anymore. I mean, that's probably part of the story, but is it all of the story? Is it all political? Is it that everybody's so woke these days that you can't say anything without offending people? Or is it that there's no free speech anymore? I mean, those are some of the things I named at the beginning of the talk, and I think they'd be the sorts of things a lot of public commentators would be saying and trying to get us to repeat, but I've got a feeling it's a little bit of a facile, politically motivated answer. I'm sorry, if that's what you were thinking, you must feel I'm judging you terribly. Apologies for that, but I mean, let's talk about it over sandwiches. And then if I was to ask the Pope in the Vatican, what's the nub of it all? Where is this locus of hostility? I might expect him to say something about selfishness, egotism, secularism. People don't believe in religion anymore. You might expect Pope Francis to be saying those are the problems. I hope I'm going to show you in the second half that he doesn't say that. He says something really bold and surprisingly different, which I think we probably need to listen to. But it'd be really good to mull over those questions in the next few minutes. And if you would like to talk to each other over a sandwich, a jug of fruit juice, that would be very good. We've got 5 minutes left for any questions that anybody might have, both online and here in the church. And then we'll head off for our break. So please feel very free. Comments, questions? Is there a microphone going round? Microphone going round? If possible, that would be great. Otherwise, I'll repeat what you're saying so that the people online can hear what you're saying. I think here's the microphone. Yeah.
Just one thing that comes to mind is I can see the purpose of the forgiveness there and telling the host that he wasn't received and welcomed.
Yes.
The only small problem I find is that Christ himself then caused a certain amount of animosity and trouble by his reaction with his host.
Yes.
So that there is that problem that sometimes in doing good, you do offend.
Absolutely right. It's a really good point. And on the whole, we don't like to do that.
No, that's just the only...
Please don't take from this talk a sort of mandate from me, as though that was worth anything, to go out and behave terribly badly at dinner parties. But it is true. Nick King, Jesuit member of my community who's translated the whole Bible, in fact, he would talk about Jesus' disastrous dinner parties. And there are, if you think about them, there are several in which his behaviour is so outrageous that it does indeed provoke this animosity. I mean, I'm tempted to say, don't try this. Jesus does this because he is Lord. But I've got a feeling sometimes the saints do similar kinds of things. And you say it's a problem, and it does feel like a problem to me, I agree. But maybe it's actually part of a way of dealing with a world of conflict. Maybe the Christian response isn't just to either avert your gaze, collude with the silence, or pretend that everything's all right. I mean, I think there is a way of dealing with conflict in a way that Jesus does it. And I've got a feeling that's what this story might be showing us. Someone else had their hands up. Was it you? It was. Just wait till the microphone comes, because I want the people at home to hear your thoughts.
Well, there were two things. The first is I've read that book, and it said something about people were allowed into, a certain number of people were allowed in when a rabbi was speaking. So she came in probably as one a few of those people, and they stood back and they were just to listen to the rabbi. The other thing I was thinking about was that I once heard a sermon in which the priest said, Simon, I have a question for you. And he was saying to us, even we might even, as you say, collude. There are 1,000 things that we can examine ourselves on that matter. And it's so easy to do, you can collude. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm glad you've read the book as well. It sounds as though you would recommend it as well, which might be. And I didn't ask you to say that. Certainly didn't pay you to. It is really. You've lost the microphone now, but. Right, okay. Okay. So this came up as a bit of advice from a good pilgrim guide in the Holy Land. Great. One more question if it's around. Is there anything online? Yes.
Is it significant in any hidden way that the woman herself says nothing?
That's a good point. It's a good question. It may be that she's observing what I assume is the rule that a woman shouldn't speak in a situation like that. Her gesture is more than mere words. Yes, it may well be. It may well be. Yeah. And of course, I mean, in a way, you might have heard me saying, look at Jesus, we've got to be like Jesus. But in a way, I'd be saying, look at her. She's the one who's serving Jesus. She's the disciple. She is just as important an exemplar for us as he is. And there's all sorts of reasons that we will never quite be able to live and work like Jesus does. But what she does is extraordinary. Microphone? It's okay.
As a woman,
Yes.
I recognised straight away that she wasn't speaking with words, but her whole action was speaking very profoundly.
Very profound and very disturbing and very, very strong message. Well, thank you for those thoughts. That's very helpful indeed. Should we take a break? I think it's about midday, and we'll be back in half an hour, at 12:30. Thank you very much indeed for all the wonderful questions.